If you can get to the point where you can appreciate that this is a learning place, as one of the most amazing psychics I ever met said, Edward A. Monroe, or rather the entity speaking through him said, what is the meaning of life? Why is life like this on Earth? Why is it so shitty? He said, well, Earth is part kindergarten and part the devil's island of space. All the little Hitlers from all over the universe are brought here to learn some very basic lessons.
Hey there, sinners. Welcome to another interview of the devil here on The Cult of You. I'm Adam Knox, and today I get to chat to Ronnie Pontiac, author of American Metaphysical Religion. This has been an eye-opening and interesting conversation. You see, I happen to share a little bit of a personal initiation journey with Ronnie. Not that we went through the same period, location, or anything like that, but we both were, vagabonds of the world in pursuit of deeper meaning, where we encountered great spiritual leaders who saw beyond the flesh into our souls and helped us connect to something deeper. Only difference is Ronnie's spiritual mentor that he happened to come across was none other than Manly P. Hall himself. For those of you that aren't familiar, Manly P. Hall is one of the great thinkers in the occult, esoteric, and metaphysical movements. His works like Secret Teaching of All Ages really provided a meta-frame of the occult worlds and metaphysical bodies in a very comprehensive manner. His knowledge over Freemasonry and Eastern and Western traditions, a lot really put together in such deep levels. Today we get to hear about the man and the story behind him, who he really was as a person, as well as that spawning time of the occult in America and how it formulated into what it is today. Ronnie and my discussion goes over a variety of topics, from the advent of spiritualism in that world, to the Creole practices in Louisiana, to the use of jazz and magic, to everything from the sexual revolutions. We touch on Jack Parsons. We look at the expression and the revival of Sekhmet and the goddess traditions. It is a jam-packed conversation, quite a long one, as you'll see by the timeline. So if you're very familiar with the subject, I recommend skipping to parts that are really familiar or really interesting for you, especially if you know Ronnie's work. If you don't, however, sit back, relax, and remember to live deliciously. Ronnie, it's an absolute pleasure to have you on the Cult of You at last.
It's a pleasure to be here. Thank you for inviting me.
No, I simply had to, because not only was I a lover of your work, this amazing like tomb of knowledge and experience and journeys, but I have to admit, I have a deep kind of soul bond with your story. I was a young, lost, troubled, mischievous expression of life, what some would almost call criminal in certain ways. And in a quest for deeper meaning and for higher discovery, I think led me to wander into an old, scary, creepy, especially at the time in that period, spiritualist center where a seance was going on.
And surprisingly enough, they led me through the doors. I wandered through the library for a little bit, and I was led to meet a spiritual mentor, one who became as a spiritual father for me. And this man was not necessarily as, shall we say, as literate and as articulate as your own, but he had this unique moment where he looked into me and I felt my soul completely revealed through this man's eyes. And in the most humble way, he expressed my trauma and my fears, my insecurities. And I knew there was a deeper awareness here. And that's something that really started my path. And I believe you had a similar start to yours.
I did. I started out as somebody who had very little interest in these matters, although I was naturally psychic. I was a really feral kid. I did not have any sense of social contract. My parents were traumatized war survivors. I was an only child, got beat up at school all the time, just not connected to the world around me. So I became, by the time I was a teenager, pretty hateful. And I had a band in my late teenage years that was dedicated to nihilism and had a big following of bikers and a lot of violence around me, a lot of petty crime. And I got lucky. I fell in love. A girl named Tamara was in trouble at a club, and she picked me for some reason as her defender. And being looked at that way was transforming in itself. And then we fell in love. But I was still aimless. I was still claustrophobic in my mentality. And as a kid, I'd run into a book that was called Atlantis, the Mother of Empires. It was an oversized volume, and I desperately wanted to shoplift it because for some reason it just was so important to me. And it was way too big to be able to do that, especially as a kid, but it stuck in my mind. And so later I got some money to go get a haircut, which was really overly optimistic. And I took it to a bookstore called the Bodhi Tree Bookstore, which used to be a real monument of the New Age in Los Angeles. And I was looking for this book, and they didn't have it in the used branch, which was, they used to call it a branch because of the Bodhi tree, get it? And it was a converted little house. It was really an adorable place. And so I went looking for something else, and I found this large tome that was the 6th edition of The Secret Teachings of All Ages, but with the other title, The Outline of Hermetic, Kabbalistic, etc. And it was a black and white book, but it was on very thick paper, oversized, and there was this portrait of the author, and it all looked very ancient and really powerful to me. So I bought it. When I was able to pay for it all the way, because I had to put it on layaway at first, I brought it home and I read it chapter by chapter. And I distinctly remember feeling like every time I read a chapter, it was like my brain opened. Like suddenly there was a door that opened and I could breathe. And that claustrophobia of the life I'd been living with no sense of where I was going or what anything meant, or I was a cynic about the normal purposes of society and such. All that changed because that book revealed a world of people devoted to researching and experiencing spirituality for themselves with these incredible artistic, scientific, mathematical expressions of what they discovered. And they were risking their lives not only to make these experiments, but to share this information with other people, often in symbolic and coded forms. So I just thought it revealed this whole other world that I could actually fall in love with. And I could understand that the world wasn't just a big joke. And so I was shocked to find out that he was still lecturing, the author of this book, and not far from where I lived. I was very scared to go down there because I knew what I'd been and the kind of things I had done. And I just thought that he and his community would have no place for something like me. I stalled for a while, but eventually my girlfriend told me, you know, he's an old man. He's in his 80s. You really should go down there. You'd be really kicking yourself if you didn't at least hear him lecture. So one Sunday we went down there. It was a beautiful morning in Los Feliz, California. These buildings in this pinkish kind of amber Mayan Egyptian architecture with inspiring sayings surrounding us, and this beautiful little gift shop. And inside was an auditorium that could fit a couple hundred people. And on it was a big velvet chair. Everybody sat, everybody was so happy, and they were discussing such interesting things. And they were also kind, and they were very kind to us. I'm very surprised to see young people there. These are mostly older people. And then out walks this very old man, and he sits down in that chair and he delivers this incredible 90-minute lecture, dropping dates and names and never missing a beat. And at one point, he looked right at me, and I had been suffering a lot of fears about earthquakes because some friends of mine were moving to Virginia Beach because they'd been frightened into it by Edgar Cayce writings and by people who were reacting to that. And they thought California was about to drop into the Pacific and disappear. And they spooked me too. And I was thinking about moving to Virginia. And Manly Hall looked straight at me and he said that there are people who suffer irrational fears of natural disasters such as earthquakes because of the guilt that they carry about how they've been living their lives. Mm-hmm. So I was astonished when he did that. Now, later when I worked for him, I found out that he often did that. He would often look at people and say something. So for example, in that same first lecture, in the case of Tamara, she, as she walked up to the auditorium, was noticing these beautiful little wildflowers that were breaking through the broken pavement on the sidewalk near the PRS, this place that he had founded. And he looked right at her and he talked about souls who exhibit the power of a flower that can break through concrete and bring beauty into the most bleak situations. Yeah. So the other funny thing about this was that I later found out that that book that I was originally so struck with when I was a kid, Atlantis, Mother of Empires, was actually written by the man who was the architect of those buildings of the Philosophical Research Society, who'd been a close friend of Manly Hall. So in a strange way, in my fascination with that Atlantis book, I was really reaching out to Manly Hall and the PRS.
Mm. That's an incredible little kind of guided experience, so to speak. That metaphysical hand. I think two questions before I step into all my deeper ones that I have, just to kind of unpack that one a little bit.
Sure.
It does seem, and I mean, even the breadth of the knowledge for anybody that's ever read the work clearly almost describes a map of consciousness and an exploration that is beyond what it's so sound compared to all the fragmented components that are out there. Working with him, because you mentioned he didn't actually have the best sight. So I don't know if he actually saw you perfectly at that point and he was more looking from a spirit eye point of view and a perspective. How was this experience of his consciousness and working with him over that period of time, and how that affect your perception of yourself, as well as kind of this trend that was starting to unfold that later has been formulated into metaphysics and these ideas of the metaphysical religion?
Mm-hmm. I'm glad you brought that up because, yes, his vision was very bad. So he basically saw colorful blurs out there in the audience, and yet was able to deliver those messages directly to people. And there was much discussion about what was going on there. Was he psychically channeling? Was he just so deeply in the Tao that whatever he said just hit the right place, flowed to the right place? And my experience of him was that I saw him very much as something like a Taoist. He was he had faith in nature. As he says in the beginning of The Secret Teachings, which he dedicates to the rational soul of the world, which is quite a statement. And so he would always say to people who were seeking him as a teacher that he didn't take students and that life and nature are our teachers. Now, about The Secret Teachings, one thing about them is there's a context there. So when you know about that context, the book makes more sense. I often hear from people, how did he do it? He was only 27 years old and he created this incredible body of knowledge and illustration and just this a real encyclopedia of the esoteric in the Western tradition. How could one man do this? And the context was, first, that when he went to Europe and he was supported by his donors and by his patrons in doing that, and by his congregation, his small congregation at the Church of the People, he was coming into a world where, because of war, metaphysics had been discredited, the occult had been discredited. And the manuscripts that he acquired that became so valuable later were bought so cheaply he would go into back rooms and there would be piles of this stuff in which he'd find alchemical manuscripts of great rarity, even a Ripley scroll at one point. And it just weren't things that were interesting people. Interesting to people. They didn't have the money for collecting. They thought this was all a bunch of superstition from the past, and that the war had proven that one must look at the world in a much more skeptical way. And this spoke to his heart. We talked about this. He wanted to preserve this material because he saw how fragile it was. So much of it had already been destroyed by war, had been burned by the churches. And as he walked into these bookstores and found these treasures devalued, he realized that somebody had to do something to make them available to the future. So not only did he acquire them, but he wanted to create a compendium in which he could distill the knowledge from these books and share them with people who otherwise wouldn't have any hope of accessing these materials. And when he created the book, he actually did have assistance from his friends and his coworkers and colleagues. And I remember him telling me about how he would be in this house that belonged to one of the leading members of the Church of the People. And the materials that became the book were spread across several rooms. And there were all kinds of people there who worked with him, all working on different sections and matching illustrations. And he guided the whole process and would move from group to group to see what they were doing and to guide them. So in a way, this was a community effort, not just the effort of one man, although he was the guiding light and then inspiration. And of course, his is the voice that we read when we read that book. So when I worked with him, he was so different. I had grown up in a family of older people. My parents in particular, because of the trauma of what they had survived, really didn't want to have children, had me quite late in life. And I had seen a lot of ugliness around aging. And I had part of my cynicism was the idea that I should really have my fun now and burn out fast and get out of here so as not to go through what I had seen around me as I was growing up. As I got around him, and here he is in his 80s, I completely had my view of aging changed because, first of all, he was multitasking at a level that I couldn't believe. He would be working on several articles for the PRS Journal. He would be working on at least 2 books at once. He would be handling the business of the place, doing charts for lectures that he would be giving about what the world would be like in the upcoming year, giving a lecture every Sunday, and then meeting with people. And he did this pretty much every day. And he could also do things like, he would say to me, there's a book that I need, and it's in the library, it's in the upper right corner, it's got a red cover, you'll probably find it on the 2nd shelf, but sometimes it's on the 3rd shelf. He had this like photographic memory about things, and his curiosity and his appreciation and his love of life were so vital. He loved talking about the art that he was surrounded in his office by the most stunning Asian art. He had a beautiful Japanese altar, just gorgeous, that was over in the corner of his office. And then his own desk was this carved Chinese desk. And he had all sorts of art objects along with a few books on his shelves. And so my girlfriend would come in there, Tamara, and she would ask him questions about everything. And he loved answering. We loved, for instance, going to museums with him and with his wife, Marie, because they would talk about everything that they saw. And they had all this information about symbolism and the times that this thing was created, or some amusing story about the creator of a work of art. And this very much changed my viewpoint about I guess you could say, of how the soul sits in the body, or the power of the soul. I could see that this person who had devoted themselves to the cultivation of the soul was living a life that was very different from the people I knew who may have been much wealthier and much more fortunate in a sense in terms of their positions in society, and who were declining because they couldn't adjust. And here was this man who had somehow ripened his life into this beautiful awareness and this ability to continue to be creative and to help people. So certainly I wouldn't compare the work that he did at the end of his life with the work that he did toward the beginning, It was not as focused, not as razor sharp in its eloquence, but it was still very effective, very eloquent, very, very helpful to people. And I got to witness that firsthand.
I think that the thing about that that's the most beautiful to listen to and really take in is we see the breadth of the intellect that's in the data, and oftentimes that breadth of intellect can be a difficult sword for many people because it cuts off from the spirit. Whereas with him, we don't have a chat GPT, right? We don't have just a dead piece of knowledge that puts out, but somebody that's truly lived and accessed that dimension of the spirit. I'm curious, in your own progression, coming from where you did, there's pretty much a war-torn trauma. There's the cynical view of reality. Finding the mentor, so to speak, on the hero's journey of your own life. What were 5 of the key biggest distinctions or shifts in belief and paradigm that ended up setting the trajectory of your life and your current paradigm where you find yourself in?
Let's see, 5 of them.
I wanted to push for a number to get nice detail out of you.
Number 1 would be probably honesty and dedication to truth, because I had been a great worshiper of the power of the lie. And when I became cynical, I learned how to lie very skillfully, and I used it all sorts of ways for gain and protection. And I was also a thief, which is a kind of lying. And so when I was at the library working for him, there was a part of me in the beginning that would see some of these books, and not really the most illustrious, some very humble books, but for whatever reason, sometimes just the binding, I really wanted that book. And I knew that no one was watching, that there was no security in the place. And I just wanted some of these books. I still remember them, actually. And he had a way about him. While I was going through this conundrum with myself, we were invited to dinner at his house, and he told this long joke, which I won't tell you, but the gist of the joke was about a person who misheard what a Catholic priest said when he was doing the Domini Fiscum. The punchline of the joke was that this thief had mistaken what he said for Dominic Friscum. And so he had stolen all this stuff from the parishioners, which was a good thing for the church because the priest had forgotten to ask for alms. And so when he told me that story, I'm going home and I'm thinking, wow, wait a minute. Like, this, was he talking to me about this? Because he often taught through jokes. And then not a day or two later, he said to me, by the way, if you want to take any of the books home and keep them indefinitely, you're welcome to.
Wow.
Which was a huge temptation. And the funny thing was, at first I didn't take home the ones that I coveted. Yeah. And I took home other ones. And then eventually one of my jobs became going through the library, picking out valuable volumes that they didn't realize that they were valuable because they'd been on the shelves for 30 or 40 years. And when they were first put there, they weren't valuable. But since I was going to a lot of bookstores and I was seeing what the prices were on things, I could tell when there were books that were worth hundreds or even thousands of dollars that were just sitting on a shelf ready to be shoplifted. So that was one, honesty. That really stuck with me. And that was also something, by the way, that the girl who'd asked me to rescue her taught me, was absolute dedication to honesty. I hadn't learned it yet, but under his tutelage, the lesson stuck with me. Second, I would say astrology, because I was still pretty cynical. I mean, when I was working for him, I didn't really have a sense of contact with spirituality or any kind of desire or relationship with the divine. I did not believe in astrology. I thought it was ridiculous. And I actually had the nuts to tell him, you really believe in this stuff? like really, Mr. Hall, you're so smart. Why would you talk about astrology? And he thought that was very amusing. And he said, well, you don't really know that much about it. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to introduce you to this astrologer named Peggy Fatemi. And she's really good at it. And she'll teach you enough that then we can debate it and have a really good conversation about it. Well, she completely blew my mind. And then I studied a bit and I realized there was something really going on. And I never even brought it up again. he knew that I was now experimenting with it. So I'd come in instead and ask him questions about astrology. What does it mean when Uranus is in the 8th house, but it's opposition Mercury, that kind of thing. So that was another one. And astrology has been a very interesting experiment that I have followed all my life, just to see, how things coincide, keeping records and notes, and much like John Dee and others who have kept astrological notations in their diaries and such, just to see repeating themes. And it's been quite fascinating. I'm very happy that I did that. Another thing I would say is that he really, and this took a long time after he was gone even, but he taught me, it was what I mentioned earlier, this trusting, if you want to call it trusting the rational soul of nature. I like to think of a quote that Eliphas Levi had, where he says, "Everything is possible to him who wills only what is true. Rest in nature." That's with a capital N. Study. Know. Then dare. Dare to will, dare to act, and be silent. Well, that phrase, rest in nature, really struck me. And it seemed to me to be very similar to the rational soul of nature. And it seemed to explain to me in part why I even got the chance to work for him, because he was looking for somebody who had some kind of facility with languages. And though mine was very meager and just based on growing up with people speaking European languages, that was enough for him. He felt that, let's call it the Tao, had brought me into his life just when he needed me. And even though I had no faith in my ability to do what he wanted me to do, he had faith in me, and I was able to accomplish what he thought I could. And so over time, I've learned this idea that our lives are this almost like a dance. It's an interaction with nature, and nature is much wiser than we think. And we often fall into this secular view of nature as this big, impersonal, monstrous thing, and that this is something that's eventually going to roll over everything we love and destroy it. And instead, we have this idea that we are here sojourning in this big mystery, and what we call nature is with us, and it is showing us the consequences of our choices, is giving us opportunities. And so we can learn how to, for instance, to help people in ways that don't harm them or harm ourselves. That's not an easy thing to do. A lot of people who set out to help actually wind up creating harm for themselves or others. It's one of the ironies of life in a world of paradoxes. To be able to have that feeling, that intuition of the naturalness of a moment is a big life changer. And it impacted all kinds of things in my life, music and film and every kind of creativity, but also health and other areas of life. So that idea of following the flow of ultimately, in a sense, of Taoism, of respecting that nature is taking you where you need to be, and you just need to learn and have faith in yourself and in nature. That's something that was so opposite from everything I ever believed. And then, since I was raised by atheists for number 4, I didn't have any sense of the divine. I was exposed to a little bit of patriarchal monotheism, and I couldn't stand it. I couldn't stand churches or temples or any of those places. Couldn't stand to listen to the leaders of patriarchal religions talking about religion and spiritual. I felt like a caged animal when I was put into places like that. But here, in his place, suddenly, I longed to be able to experience some of these things that other people around me were experiencing, but also that I could read about. I could read about Jacob Boehme looking at a flash of light on a pewter plate and suddenly seeing the structure of the universe unfold in a vision, or what later was called cosmic consciousness, or Plotinus's amazing description, which is my favorite explanation of astrology, where he says, the stars are like letters that inscribe themselves at every moment in the sky. Everything in the world is full of signs. All events are coordinated. All things depend on each other. Everything breathes together. Now, I'd had inklings of that, in my life when I was enjoying nature or some moment of epiphany occurred, but I could see in him that he was living in that all the time. So for example, when Tamara and I asked him, well, what do you do? I mean, what are your spiritual practices at this stage in your life? Do you meditate? And he said, I don't need to meditate. My everyday activities are my meditation. And he was talking about the Zen walking meditation and the idea that once you really get meditation, then every activity you do is an opportunity for applying meditation. And this is a goal that I've been working on for a long time. And then finally, I would say that I was very lucky because when I got there, this place had ripened into something beautiful. It was the late autumn for its trajectory of existence. And it wasn't going to be around much longer. And in fact, after 7 years, he sent Tamara and I away because he could see what was about to happen, which was a debacle, quite horrific. But he was so kind that even though we wanted to be there to do whatever we could to help and to defend him, because we felt such loyalty, he told us we were too young to take on these kinds of problems and to go have our own lives. And so if I had been there at any other time, he was hanging around with mayors and governors and movie stars, and Elvis was sending people down there to get books signed. And it was hard to get to see Manly Hall. But when I was there, first, it was all run by women, and they turned out to be mostly the widows of the men who used to run it. But I didn't know that. I just knew that it was Manly Hall and a whole bunch of women. And these older women were also just amazing dynamos and sources of wisdom and inspiration and encouragement. And it was humble. It was wholesome. It was down to earth. It was so healthy, and it just felt like being in the kind of community you want to be in. And he himself, he was so funny, he really humorous and so kind and so down to earth again. He didn't like to talk about deep mystical subjects when you had dinner with him. He would if I had questions, but he preferred to talk about jokes or what I was doing at school or how the Dodgers were doing in baseball. And that down to earthness over time, I mean, certainly it affected me strongly in music, because when Tamara and I went back into music after being with him, we chose Riot Girl and punk rock. I mean, I guess I should say that Tamara chose Riot Girl and I went with her on that ride, but I was happy to do that. And these movements were very humble, very egalitarian. Everybody had to be equal. Women were given equal rights with men in these scenes, and even more rights in some cases, because there was a feeling that women should be encouraged more, because men had already said everything that could possibly be said in song, but women had been held back and only allowed to play very limited roles. So that humbleness, that kind of do-it-yourself style approach to things, and the way that he built a life that he could have been much more famous. I mean, he's not really that famous. He's not all that well known, but he could have been, bigger than Crowley probably if he had wanted that. But toward the end of his life, those last 10, 20 years, he really enjoyed just the day-to-day simplicity of life. And that has really stuck with me. And over the years, more and more, I've come to appreciate that. And I've tried to recreate that in my own life, keeping it very simple.
That's an incredibly beautiful tale. And I can see definitely some of that amazing gift of storytelling that he had and put in such beautiful metaphor, and everything has also kind of rubbed off on you with the hidden teachings almost in these shared memories, which, I thank you for. I want to unbox more of this journey as I kind of start walking down the chapters and the ideas in the book, at least in terms of the ones that I feel I have enough insight into ask penetrating questions for as we progress. A lot of my training initially started off in spiritualism. And spiritualism has its kind of roots in those sisters and the journey, how they kind of got started. How was the spiritualist journey kind of begun in that part of the world? How's it evolved? What was its effect or its influence in terms of the metaphysical world? And then you share a very interesting story about Houdini and the Witch of Limestreet, I think it was.
Yes.
And there's this interesting kind of provocative play between almost sexuality and spirituality, as well as the charlatan, the fraud, and the authentic. The dance between the crime and the madman and the genius seems very perfectly flowed. Can you explore that a little bit more deeply for us?
Sure. So spiritualism in America goes way back. It goes into the very earliest days of the colonies, where in one of the Shaker colonies, there was a story told about some young girls who heard heavenly music in the air and they passed out. They were carried to their beds and they began to prophesy. And they were called sleeping prophets, just like Edgar Cayce would later be called a sleeping prophet. And also some of the Quakers were experimenting with spiritualism in the very earliest days of the colonies. There was a real explosion, however, in the 1800s with the Fox sisters. And this was a relatively poor family, no real education to speak of. And this phenomenon occurred involving knocking and other sounds. It was described as loud knocks that would, one moment they'd be behind the wall, then under the floor, and then up by the ceiling. And these knocks would answer questions. One knock, yes. Two knocks, no, I believe was how it went. And some of these questions that were answered were very secret neighborhood events or mysteries that were solved, and people were astonished. So they brought their friends, and word spread very fast. And soon there were reporters, and fairly soon, worldwide, there was interest in this phenomenon. So, for instance, Madame Blavatsky, who'd been touring in Egypt and all sorts of interesting places, came to America right around then to write for a newspaper about these spiritualist phenomenon. At first, she was pro-spiritualism, but later she turned against it. And this came out of two major influences. One was very certainly the burgeoning need for feminism, that women were treated as if they had nothing to say. They were not allowed to speak in the presence of men who ran everything. I mean, after all, in the United States, a woman couldn't even get her own checking account until the 1960s. So way back then in the 1800s, you only imagine. I mean, they weren't allowed to choose who they would marry. They were beaten by their husbands often, who often had alcohol problems, and it was a terrible life for many women. Now, all of a sudden, the Fox sisters, this evolved from these knocks, and there were other mediums who developed into voice mediums, or who would simply use their own voice and be channeling whatever words came into their mind. So a good example of this is Victoria Woodhull. She started out with a very traumatized childhood. Her father would take her and her sister on these kind of snake oil journeys through the backcountry, cheating people, and he was abusing them sexually and may have been prostituting them as children. And he noticed that they had a good kind of psychic sensitivity or intuition that he could further exploit. But Victoria was smart, and she figured out that she was actually quite good at this, and she believed in it, and she got away from him, and she and her sister went off and set themselves up doing mediumship on their own, and they attracted quite a following with their medical channeling and also just their information about the afterlife and such. And Victoria matured into a woman who really has some interesting accomplishments. So, for example, she became the first female stockbroker on Wall Street because one of the great industrialists was so impressed by her predictions for him in his business investments that he put money behind her, and they opened up their own brokerage. She became the first woman to address Congress, and she claimed that the Greek orator Demosthenes provided the speech that she gave, which was widely praised. And she ran a muckraking newspaper that got her into a lot of trouble, but she challenged the corrupt politics of New York City. And she became a well-known suffragette and feminist, although later she was somewhat discredited and left out by the leading suffragettes because Victoria was fighting for what was then called free love, and it wasn't the same as the 60s free love. this free love simply meant that women should be allowed to marry people that they love. She dared to say that women should also be considered when it came to orgasm and pleasure and sexuality, and suggested that only that way would normal children be produced, because in this one-sided way where a woman was suffering the whole time, how could she possibly raise anything but a twisted soul? And she was also advocating for birth control. And as many of the feminist suffragettes, many of them were, she was a very strong proponent for ending the enslavement of people in America. And she's a classic example, I think, of this interesting connection between spiritualism and the desire to end slavery in America and the need that women felt to be heard. And so what happens is, all of a sudden, here is a woman who couldn't address people and without being told, shut up and go in the kitchen. And now they could stand or lay down or sit in front of a huge audience of men, many prominent, and tell them, this is what you're doing wrong. This is what's wrong with society. This is what's going to happen next. This is what we need to do, which must have been very thrilling and empowering. Yeah. Another influence here was that just before this, America had, around the time of the New England Transcendentalists, a tremendous love affair with Plato and Platonism. And this is something that I cover at length in my book because it was so shocking to me. This ranged from a newspaper called The Platonist that was published in St. Louis, Missouri, around the time of the gunfight at the OK Corral, when St. Louis was still a cattle town. And this was a newspaper devoted to translations of Plato and the Neoplatonists, like Plotinus, who we mentioned earlier, and even had this weird, for me, I was shocked when I saw this. It was Abner Doubleday, who was famous as the inventor of baseball, even though he wasn't, in America, and was also a well-known Civil War general who fired the first shot on the Union side in the American Civil War. And Abner Doubleday turned out had a lot of occult interests, and he was an early vice president of the Theosophical Society, but he published a translation of Eliphas Levi's Transcendental Magic serially in this thing called The Platonist. And there would be Plato clubs and Plato parties, and big newspapers and magazines ran stories about Plato, saying that really in the work of Plato, we see the beginning of Christianity and a foreshadowing of everything Christian. So it's right for us to be studying Plato. And Platonism really infused the American psyche at that time. And so there's many scholars argue that you can't really separate spiritualism from Platonism. But there's another very strong stream here, which is the indigenous and also the African, brought through the Caribbean in the slave trade, of enslaved people who brought their religion here and were able to continue practices in disguised ways. For example, martial arts exercises that were made into dances, so that they're just dancing, but it was really practicing fighting moves. And so there was interest amongst many people with these kinds of interests about, well, what do you do? What do you believe? What do the indigenous people believe? Even in the earliest colonies, you see examples of American colonials who want to know from the indigenous tribes, what are your religious beliefs? What are your dreams? What is your afterlife? And they were comparing notes. And so one interesting thing about American spiritualism is that we often find that the main spirit, what they call the control was the spirit who supposedly facilitated the connection between the medium or channel and any of the spirits that were asked to come by there and communicate. And often the control was some sort of indigenous spirit. The names are usually very corny, and they use these really racist accents and such. But it is fascinating to see here that you have indigenous characters as the doorkeepers for spiritualism in its early days. And so spiritualism, it seems to me, was a focus point for minorities in America who were being oppressed and suppressed, and whose own traditions were under constant assault from the established traditional institutions, who were never as popular, by the way, as they pretend to be, and still pretend to be, because we get this picture that America was so Christian and the Pilgrims were deeply devoted Christians, and there was no occultism. There was nothing like that in America, but that's absolutely false. The Virginia farmers were using all kinds of astrology and were using special symbols to ward off evil. And the Pilgrims had members of their community who were very interested in alchemy and in astrology and what would now be considered occult arts by people who are members of a church. And there was a much more of an openness that we wouldn't expect to find. So, for example, John Winthrop the Elder, who was the first governor of Massachusetts Bay Colony, his son, John Winthrop the Younger, was an avid alchemist. He became the governor of the Connecticut Territory, and he was very deeply into the Rosicrucians, and he actually went to Europe as a youth with a friend trying to find Rosicrucians. And when he was disappointed that the people he met didn't seem to be the real thing to him, he came back and he lived his life according to Rosicrucian principles. And when he moved here, following his father, he had these big crates of alchemical equipment shipped out here, but they also included a significant amount of the library of John Dee, possibly the most notorious European occultist of the era. And he marked his crates with John Dee's Monas Hieroglyphicus symbol, which was considered an occult symbol. And then finally, when Christian Mather, one of the American leaders embroiled in the Salem witch tragedy, when he eulogized John Winthrop the Younger, he described him as Hermes Christianus, the Christian Hermes.
Wow.
Who would expect a pilgrim to use a reference to Hermes? It's very strange. So as we go through this American story, we find that the churches, for example, in the 1680s, the governor of New York was writing saying that we can't get these people with their crazy religious opinions to come to church, and only 15% of colonists belong to any particular
denomination.
Exactly. And so in the 1650s, apparently only 1/3 of all adults ever belonged to any kind of a church, let alone being devoted to a certain institution. As spiritualism develops, first there's this big explosion of it, and then the Fox sisters, one of them says that it was fraudulent, that they had learned how to pop their joints in a way. I don't know how they threw their joint popping so it sounded like it was coming from other areas, but she claimed that they
ventriloquism.
Yes, but she claimed that that's what they were doing. Now later she retracted the retraction, saying that she had issued it under pressure from Christians who were trying to save her from alcoholism and poverty. But it still did great damage. But the damage was also being done by so many fraudulent mediums, because this became a very popular activity for organized crime. They would refer suckers to each other or clients. They would keep books of information, and they would read the obituaries and find out what they could about people who died recently, and then try to cultivate relationships that would get them into the houses of rich people who had losses. And so there was a lot of really fraudulent stuff going on. There was also a way that sexuality became embroiled in it, especially a little bit later on, like more in the 20s and in the 10s and 20s, where we see the most notorious case possibly is the Witch of Limestreet, who Houdini discredited, or worked very hard to discredit. And she had this, it's kind of a tragic story in a way, because what seems to have happened is that she married an older man who was a doctor. And apparently the doctor was fascinated with spiritualism, but he was also fascinated with some kind of, apparently, some sort of cuckolding fantasy around his wife. And so what they would do is, in order to prove that she wasn't doing anything tricky, she would be in this very sheer robe and nothing else. So you could see everything. And that was like a peep show. I mean, it wasn't really you couldn't go see naked girls very easily in those days. And so here you could pay to see a medium. And if it was one of those mediums, you might get a lot more than you paid for, because the story was, one of the famous ones was that one of her spirit guides was this really racist character named Baby Ruth. And Baby Ruth would get into the laps of wealthy men in this tiny robe and say, Baby Ruth wants some candy, right? And so this kind of sexuality often led to relationships that were useful for the mediums, because a reporter, for example, might publish really positive reports because they got all turned on, or a rich person would vouch for the medium and send friends to the medium. And when Houdini tried to disprove the Witch of Limestreet, who'd been tested by various groups of psychic experimenters and explorers, and some had found her to be shockingly accurate. And what was going on there, no one is really quite sure, because once she was put into the kind of restrictions that Houdini gave her, she found it very difficult to do anything that was impressive. But then when the restrictions were removed, she might once again report things that people couldn't explain. And so later she said that she didn't really know what this was. She didn't know if it was telepathy or if it was spirits, and she didn't think it was spirits. And she kept changing her mind, a very common kind of thing that occurred later in life with some of these mediums. Houdini, meanwhile, while he's trying to disprove her, actually commits an act of fraud himself, according to his assistant. He's so eager to defeat this woman. And there's a description in one of the records left by this where he's trying to find out exactly what she's doing. So they're in this dark room, and he's got her in this box, and he's got his knee up against her inner thigh. And you just get this creepy like feeling out of it when you're reading it, that what are they doing here actually? This doesn't seem to have very much to do with spiritualism at all. And so then once this fraud became so obvious, and communities had been built up like Lilydale and others, where people would come in the summer and they would stay, and there'd be houses, and all the houses were lived in by mediums. And Lilydale still exists, actually, despite scandals that occurred back in the day. As it changed, it turns into something different, really, I believe, with Edgar Cayce. And Edgar Cayce comes along, and suddenly this is a whole nother level of thing. He's not just talking about, here's your dead relative, and your Aunt Sophie says this, or this is what the afterlife is like, or you should invest in that, now he's talking about why you're sick. And he's talking about what you're meant to do in this life. And even though he was very Christian, and there's a lot of Christian ideas in his work, once he encountered theosophy in the South, he encountered reincarnation. And to his shock, he apparently wasn't very comfortable with this in the beginning, he started to talk about past lives in relation to medical problems. That became one of the main focuses for him. And so all of his readings were collected together, an organization was formed, and his writings became very influential and remained influential well into the New Age. They still are to a degree. And his health readings actually became a big part of the whole New Age holistic movement. And many of the ideas that he presented have become accepted by modern medicine. At the time, they were ridiculed. And then it further develops from there, I believe. Notice how it's moving away from ectoplasm and tables that are jumping around and horns that are playing. And you had examples, for example, of mediumistic family musician bands who they would get themselves tied down, and there would be instruments laid out all around them. And then the instruments would start to play in the dark while we knew that these guys were tied down. But one day, some smart-ass college students brought in a new form of artificial light. And while the music was going, they turned it on. And there were all these guys playing their instruments because they knew how to get out of the ropes. And by the way, it didn't stop them from touring. People loved it anyway. Even when they knew it was fake, they kept going. So Yeah. So that stuff stopped. And then with Cayce, you have more of an intellectual imagination pursuit. He's almost getting into science fiction areas with his stories about Atlantis. And many of these ideas are still au courant. Like I still hear people talking about, for example, when they say that there's experimentation with combining DNA of animals with DNA of human beings, or other forms of radically modifying human genetic inheritance, they talk about, oh boy, that's Atlantis all over again. And a lot of this stuff comes from the Cayce mythos. And then as we get a little bit further into the 30s and 40s, we find a very interesting pair who are almost forgotten at this point, but were wildly famous in the day, which is Stuart Edward White and his wife, Elizabeth, better known as Betty White, another once famous Betty White. And they were very rich people he was a very successful writer. He was a friend of Teddy Roosevelt and a great famous outdoorsman who has trouts and redwood groves named after him in California. And she came from a very wealthy family as well. They had a storybook romance all their lives, never had children, just a super happy marriage. And they began experimenting with a Ouija board for fun at a party one night. And this led to some of the most intense channeling that has ever happened. And in her case, this was completely different. Like now there was no interest in medical stuff or past lives or any of that stuff. Now it was all, what is the difference between this world and the next world, and how can we in this world have communication with the next? Everything was reworked. So instead of spirits, they talked about the invisibles. They called this world that we inhabit in a body the obstructed universe, and the world that we go to in the afterlife when we leave our bodies, the unobstructed universe. And they explain that both of these universes occupy the same place, but the frequencies are so different that the obstructed universe is a place of low frequencies. The unobstructed is high frequency. And they said the purpose of life was that even the simplest being begins with a form that is a quality of consciousness, that everything that exists has a quality of consciousness. And in that form it occupies, its job is to aggregate as much quality of consciousness as it can until it fills up the potential that that quantity was capable of. And then it graduates to a new quality of consciousness, a new form. And then it gathers up all the consciousness, quality of consciousness that it can for that new form that it's in. And the quantity is built up again, and then it graduates again to a new level, and so on and so on. All very fascinating stuff. And their books were very popular, at first written anonymously. In a sense, Stuart wrote them with his name on them, but he didn't say who the medium was. He didn't say, this is my wife. And then something happened where they were warned that the true purpose of the activity was about to begin, and it might not be very comfortable for them. And sure enough, Betty got sick. And Edward Stuart thought that this would be a test, that they would be able to heal Betty. And so he pulled out all stops trying to convince her to heal herself. And she got sicker and sicker and was suffering. And then finally he realized what he was doing. And he tells a story about how he sat down in this sofa chair. She was dying in the next room in a coma. The doctor was in there. And he said out loud to her, I understand what I've done. I understand that I've held you here, but I don't want to do that. I want you to go if you're ready to go. I know you'll still be with me. And the doctor came out and told her that she had passed, but before she had passed, she had woken up, had smiled at him, and had spoken to him and said, "It's okay, Doc. I talked to my boy and I can go now." And then she breathed her last.
Damn.
Well, he was overcome, Stuart, with the feeling of her presence. He described it as that feeling you get when you're with a loved one and perhaps you're both reading books in a room with a fireplace going, and just the feeling of each other's presence, that kind of love, that kind of contentment with life that can bring, is something that he felt times 1,000, and it never left him for the rest of his life. And he felt that this was Betty present with him, but he didn't want to test any of it. He was content. he thought that was it. And he would just write that ending of the book that he sensed her presence. And he avoided any kind of mediumship. It was right before Pearl Harbor happened, and he toured America staying with friends because he didn't want to be in the house where he'd lived with her. And near the end of the tour, he stopped with the friends with whom all this experimentation with spirituality had begun, who were famous psychics whose pseudonym was Joan and Darby. They'd written a book about World War I and people who went over to the other side during that. And so when he was with them, they said, why don't we do a session? And we will not talk to Betty. We'll just talk to the spirits we normally talk to. And he agreed to that. But Betty stormed in right away, called him by a nickname that only she knew. And according to him, spent 2.5 hours going through detail after detail after detail that only she could know. And then the real kicker was that there was only one thing that he thought she got wrong. The story about blue slippers when she was in the hospital. But it turned out that he was wrong, that she actually was right, that the blue slipper incident had occurred, but he had forgotten it in the midst of all the trauma. And she said, yeah, I wanted you to know that, this isn't just telepathy or something, because even you didn't know this. And so after that, she worked with him on several books, and he would spend time meditating in the room that she had lived in. And he always felt very close to her, and he would answer letters from people who had questions or who had lost their loved ones. And it was a huge source of comfort for people who had suffered losses in World War II. And so they were such an example of this high level of purity, if you will, in the way that they conducted themselves in these experiments and what they brought through. And it's interesting because they illustrate one thing that is important, I think, about all this, which is because they had money, because they were already wealthy, they weren't trying to make their livings at this stuff. And there's a pressure for people who try to make their livings at metaphysics. And obviously we want people like that. We want teachers and podcasters and writers and others who are willing to share their knowledge. But there is that pressure that occurs to shape what you're writing to the audience. There's a pressure from, as a writer, the publisher will give your book a name perhaps that you didn't really, not what you wanted it to have, but it's meant to help sell the book. Or I remember well when I would lecture in Manly Hall's Place and on my own in the PRS days, how to get a bigger audience, to make the audience you already had happier, you had to hit certain subjects, and the things that you perhaps really wanted to speak about, you couldn't. And I talked to Manly Hall about that, and he kind of commiserated a little bit. He was saying that he would love to talk about Neoplatonism and get really deep into stuff that's very complex, but really for his audience, what they required was distilling the ancient wisdom into practical knowledge, practical applications that can help people improve their lives. And so I think that as we look at the history of metaphysics, we always have to keep in mind that for many of these people, they were trying to make money, and many of them were unsuccessful. So they were struggling. And some of the decisions that they made, some of the fraud that occurs in some of these stories may have been the result of people who had genuine abilities, but who, under the pressure of just trying to survive, were forced to take measures that reflected badly on them.
I think that's such an essential point right there. And again, there's that old classic Maslowian hierarchy of needs, right? And we see that the need for survival can dominate sometimes over and even repress the spirit that is there, which doesn't, I think, short circuit the fact that even as the cerebral has neural networks all the way, or synaptic connections all the way to the frontal lobe, it can still override. But there's an interesting series. There's so much juice in what you've just shared. So I'm gonna unpack parts so we can open up that even more. There's this interesting phenomena historically around the gifted psychic or gifted medium that's often less intellectual. They're less bombarded down with the intellect, and they're more free. Not necessarily that ignorance is a gateway into spirituality,
Right.
but they're less associated to the left portion of the brain, and they're more associated to the right, the creative, imaginative portion of the brain. And it's also the interesting thing that you see more women oftentimes as mediums in the old spiritualist movement. And we do know that there's there's a better communication between the hemispheres in women than there was predominantly in men, especially if we look at the roles that we also had to play and kind of fall into. So this adds so many more interesting subjects that I want to unpack here with us. One of the others that also kind of comes in, so I'm going to throw a few ideas here together, and I'm going to let you bake us something interesting to chew on further with it. There's that component. There's this component in this relationship between sexuality and spirituality that's always kind of commingled in many ways. And even if we look at the Taoist ideas, there's also the philosophy that the energies in the base chakras are connected very much to the pituitary and the pineal glands. There's sexual relationship between kundalini and the higher functionality. So there is this magnetism, there is this electromagnetism that's very deeply tied in that relationship and in the psychic activity. But then we see this interesting thing, and you pointed this out in your book about when you talked about the brotherhood of Luxor, which please I'm going to ask you to also expand on a little bit for of the viewers that have never heard of that or have only heard the outside components of it. But you pointed that there was originally also a kind of a sex magic or a sexuality kind of practice, which then slowly evolved into this interest with the higher, the interest with the cleaner, so to speak, or the more intellectual pursuits, astrology and New Age thinking and things like that. Could there be the struggle of the shadow dynamic within us, and especially in the culture? Now we have a lot of people moving there, many of them being slaves. We have people there. You share the story about the pagan pilgrim. It starts with Morton, I believe it was, who almost rebelled against a lot of what was going on and supported a lot of these people to kind of free them from these thinking and empower them and support them. So there's, people on both sides of the fences. And it almost seems like the same as that duality of poverty and richness and the balancing dance of spirit between that. We see that in this melting pot of development starting to unfold and develop itself. Could there be almost like a shadow projection or a shame that then manifests? And I really love that you pointed out that, there's this almost like this myth of Christianity that everyone was Christian, which is really not the case. In fact, there's probably more occult paradigms, the founding fathers being Masons and the influences of Rosicrucianism and how that really built up these core paradigms. Could there be this layer of acceptance that almost gets cracked a little bit as we move to the hippie stage? Because there's so much here, because I do want to talk about the unfolding of the slavery, how that moved in kind of New Orleans and the advent of jazz and the effects of the music, but also how this, let me stop there. Let me stop there and if we can explore these ideas a little bit.
Okay. Yes, it's funny because the thing about America, if you usually you start out as an American and you're taught, I'm not so sure it's so much that way now, but when I was a kid, you were taught all these things about America, how great America is and how exceptional and how America is the hope of the world and America never does anything wrong and one must simply love the flag and do what we are asked. And then you run into the shadow of America. And the shadow of America is the American Empire. And you suddenly find out that America has been up to all kinds of terrible things. And you suddenly find out that America hasn't been the good guy all that much. And for me and for many other people, this leads to a kind of rebellion. And so much of music, including my own music, was a rebellion against the idea that America is this, wonderful Christian presence in the world that only does good. And you try to alert people. So for instance, the Riot Girl movement was all about the abuse of women and how women were suffering at the hands of men in the patriarchy of America. And they still do. I mean, I don't feel the Riot Girl movement changed lives of many, including myself in a big way. But look at what's going on in America now. The same battles are being fought for freedom for women and for freedom of religion. And so then you begin to look at, so we used to, for instance, do shows that were sponsored by the Black Panthers, and the Black Panthers would help us get our work out into prisons and such. And there we learned about what was going on and the way that the judicial system and the police were were corrupt and how they were preying on the local communities. And the Black Panthers, who we had been raised to think were these vicious, violent, communist criminals, were people that were giving breakfasts to local kids and had collecting books so kids had something to read, and were trying to tell the gang members to stay out of prison, and teaching people about the law and about their history. They were completely different and wonderful people. I met some of the most beautiful people in that scene. And so, but then as I was working on this book, I found there was another shadow of America, a third shadow. And this one was very exciting because this was, you could call it, I guess, America's esoteric shadow.
Yeah.
And here were a whole bunch of people and organizations and communities that were so different and yet so typically American. And one of the best examples, I think, is Thomas Morton. This is a guy who was sent out when he was about 50 years old by the Royalists to be competition for the Puritans. And the Puritans, the Pilgrims, were not popular for the most part in England. They wanted to get rid of them. They were really a hassle. They were very judgmental, and they were always trying to change things. And the English at that point, the dominant English attitude was more the Cavaliers. They liked drinking. They wore big cod pieces. They liked going out with women, and they loved Shakespeare and poetry. And they were fascinated by Plato and paganism and astrology and science, the beginnings of science, alchemy. And here were the Puritans and the Pilgrims who were against most of that. You couldn't laugh too loud. You couldn't walk too fast. Everything was so controlled. And the Royalists didn't want the Pilgrims to have the only foothold on the American continent. So they picked this guy, Thomas Morton, age 50, to travel across the Atlantic and start a new center, a new, not colony, but a trading post. Okay. And so there was this beautiful green round hill right on the Atlantic, just green and blue. And he picked that spot and he named it Marymount. And it was a mountain named after Mary, but it was also Marymount as in let's have a good time with the ladies. Mm-hmm. And it was also Latin, a pun for the male genitalia. And this was typical of him and of this type of Englishman. Lots of humor. Thomas Morton has a distinction of being the first American to publish a fart joke. Huh. He was the first American to have a wild party that got closed down. And he was the first American to be foreclosed upon by a corporation, because the Pilgrims were actually, they were a corporation.
Oh, wow.
Yeah. And so he opens up this trading post that could not be more different. The Pilgrims, they have to have a big wall around their settlement, and they're terrified of the wilderness. Their dealings with the indigenous people are very difficult and fraught with violence. And Tom doesn't even need to have a fence. He just is so kind to everybody and so open and so caring that everybody who comes to him gets a fair deal. And eventually he decides to throw this huge party on May Day, because May Day is a very popular holiday in England, and he loved that holiday. They got a big yellow pine and they stripped it and they put it up with ribbons, and he wrote a poem that was kind of bawdy, and they put it on the pine, and he invited pirates and trappers and indigenous tribes and just anybody and everybody to this party, including the Pilgrims who did not attend. And so the Pilgrims characterized it as a wild party, drunkenness, and people were fornicating everywhere, which was just their wild imaginations, as is still the case, the projection of one's own suppressed desires. And he said, actually, the indigenous women were considerably more moral than the average English girl back home. Wow. And the parties were fairly wholesome. They were very pleasant. Nobody got too drunk, and it was actually a kind of different vision of America, of what America could become: diverse, inclusive, celebrating life. And another thing that was different between he and the Pilgrims was that the Pilgrims they would very eagerly embrace the slave trade. They saw the power that it would give them. And so when they got the opportunity through King James, they were happy to be the third angle of that triangle. Mm. And he was not. Morton was against enslaving people. And so he actually exposed himself to danger more than once in order to make sure that somebody was not sent to one of the slave plantations where life was short and brutal, and risked his position and even his life to help people escape from that fate. So you could not get a more different vision of America there. And he would write these beautiful descriptions of America, and he, for instance, would map out the different springs in the areas, because the natives, the indigenous people, had found that when you drank from this particular spring, you would have strong dreams. This spring was especially refreshing, and there was one he described that bubbled up from natural crystals, and just amazing. He was just in love with the nature in America, and the Pilgrims really feared it. So he was very successful, and they attacked him, and they tried legally to get at him. They did all sorts of chicanery, and they finally arrested him, and they moored him. They tried to starve him to death. They sent him on a long boat trip. They hoped he wouldn't survive, back to England. And he wound up fighting them in the courts. He won at first, but ultimately he failed. And in fact, many of the members of his community later became important people in the Pilgrim community and accepted all the Pilgrim bigotry and all that conformity, and because they saw it was the only way for them to survive and to flourish in this new environment. But when Thomas Morton failed, it seems to me that there was a failure of this other vision of America, except that it didn't really fail. It kept going. So you go a little bit later, and you've got the early beginnings of Harvard and Yale, and they had alchemy labs in those schools. The presidents, some of the early presidents of these famous colleges were alchemists and astrologers. And you find the story of a Yale president who had been taught by a wandering Kabbalist who, for whatever reason, came all the way out to the American colonies, and who was so moved by the Kabbalah that he gave a speech saying that he thought every college in America should teach Kabbalah.
What a beautiful thing. If that would happen.
Right. And so then as you come up further, so there's this constant, and of course America starts out this way because you have these German pietist, Rosicrucian influenced and Paracelsus influenced communities of immigrants coming from Germany and going deep into Pennsylvania wilderness to start communities like Ephrata, where incredible music was made, and they wanted to get away from this conformity. And so the Pilgrims come out to America to get away from the Church of England, and then the son of the governor of the Pilgrims leaves Massachusetts Bay Colony to start the Connecticut territory because he's trying to get away from his own father's too conformist approach to religion. And Americans just keep moving north, west, south, and establishing new communities so that they can believe and practice in the way that they want to. And so the Hermetic Brotherhood of Luxor is there's so many mysteries involved here. And none of them are really solvable, most likely, although you never know with history. There was a Brotherhood of Luxor related to Madame Blavatsky. And for a time, the feeling was that this must have been the origin of the Hermetic Brotherhood of Luxor, but it now seems unlikely that that's the case. There's no question that Blavatsky was in Egypt studying with something that was calling itself the Brotherhood of Luxor. And K. Paul Johnson, for example, has written a couple of very interesting books about the real people who might be behind the theosophical masters of Blavatsky, and there do seem to be real people. And so the Hermetic Brotherhood of Luxor was connected to a fellow who called himself Max Theon, who appears to have been a Hasidic Jewish Kabbalist, and whose own ideas about the cosmos were more mystical and less religious oriented, in the sense that they were not strictly within the tradition that he had been trained in. And some people believe that he was actually the originator, but the mystery there is that his own teachings bear very little resemblance to the teachings of the Hermetic Brotherhood of Luxor.
Okay.
Now, when we look at the teachings of the Hermetic Brotherhood of Luxor, what we see is the influence of, for one, most certainly Paschal Beverly Randolph, who is this incredible combination of races, mostly considered a black man at the time, but he had white blood and some indigenous blood, or at least he claimed to have that. And he was a brilliant occultist who would have fit in beautifully in later times, would have been a very popular guy in Haight-Ashbury or during the New Age, but was way ahead of his time. And for instance, when he first started, he was a spiritualist first, and he started to have his own teachings, but no one cared. So he went to Europe, and supposedly he met Levi while in Europe, but he came back and said that he had had Rosicrucian initiation, and then he released his teachings under the imprimatur of being Rosicrucian. Suddenly he was popular and influential.
Interesting.
And later in life, he said, well, that was all a lie because I just wanted people to listen to me. And I didn't learn that from anybody but myself. But once I said it was Rosicrucian, suddenly people paid attention to me. Nevertheless, he was a very powerful influence. And he had these infamous parties where he would gather, supposedly, he gathered these wealthy white women with black men, but also with occultists, and they would have hashish, and they would party all night long, and ecstasy was part of the path. And he was another person like Victoria Woodhull who was fighting for birth control, and who was talking about the importance for women to have love and to have sexual pleasure for the future of the race. And he was undoubtedly a major influence somehow into the Hermetic Brotherhood of Luxor. And there were also a couple of female writers who also certainly were a strong influence, whether they were plagiarized or they were friends. I mean, one of them appears to have been a friend with one of the principals in the Hermetic Brotherhood. And so when it first comes out here, it's got two leaders, one in the South and one on the East Coast. And the one on the East Coast gets into trouble because it turns out that back in England, he was a fraud who went to jail. And somebody figured this out, and they actually had a picture of him, his mugshot, and that started circulating around America. And this really devalued the Hermetic Brotherhood of Luxor for a moment there because people thought that it was some kind of a fraudulent activity. But it was saved by two people, a woman named Aldridge, who in the East ran the lodge in the East. And the funny thing, by the way, about the Brotherhood of Luxor in America is that, for instance, the lodge in the East was predominantly women, despite the name, and was run by a woman. And Aldridge's husband was a fascinating man who opened up this model community for miners. He was a wealthy mining magnate, and he ran a beautiful community. He gave them great education, great medicine, great culture, and as a result, they were wonderful workers, and it was very successful, and nobody imitated it, tragically. He proved that you could treat the workers well and give them great conditions, and they would be even better and more loyal, but no one cared. So
It's time.
yes, very much. And in the West, we have Thomas Johnson, who was the leader of the lodge in the West. And Thomas Johnson is especially interesting to me because I mentioned earlier the Platonist. And the Platonist is really what started my book, because one time when I was in Manly Hall's vault, where we would have lunch together, and he would let me pick out books and ask questions about them. He was so kind. He'd tell me, this is where I got it. This is who the author was. This is what it's about. And I saw this one big brown tome, and I thought, okay, I've got to have this thing. I got to know what this is. And when I opened it up, it had that newspaper that I described. So that Thomas Johnson was the publisher of The Platonist, and one of the people who did the most translations in it. He was well known at the time, especially by the New England Transcendentalists, as a translator of ancient Greek philosophy. He also was one of the first people to publish any writing about Sufi mysticism in America. And he had been a vice president of the Theosophical Society, but he was really became the leader of the Hermetic Brotherhood of Luxor in America. Now, the way it operated under his guidance was there were little ads like in newspapers or in the back of theosophical journals. And people were getting disgusted with the Theosophical Society because Madame Blavatsky was doing all kinds of stuff to show miracles of one kind or another that were questionable. And many people didn't like that. And she fell afoul of some journalists, and she decided to leave for India, where she was more welcome. And many Americans felt rejected by that because the society actually started in New York. Okay. So when she did that, they were looking for somewhere else to go. And the Hermetic Brotherhood of Luxor became a popular destination. So the way you'd get a little ad in the back of a journal, and it would say that the Hermetic Brotherhood of Luxor was looking for potential members, and if you were interested, you should send them $1 and your birth data or your birth chart. And if they felt that you were appropriate, then they would contact you. And it was basically a mail order kind of thing where you could get lessons in various subjects like astrology and hermeticism and magic mirrors for scrying, so that you could look at your past lives or look at the future or current events through this magic mirror. And it also had a form of sexual teaching that seemed to have been an evolution of Paschal Beverly Randolph's approach, but it's really not very exciting. The idea was that if you were married only, you could get a hashish pill from the Hermetic Brotherhood of Luxor, and using the correct astrology and the correct elevation of attitude, you would take that pill with your wife and you would have sex to conceive a child. And if you did it at the right time on this hashish and with the right astrology and with the right attitude of lovingness and spiritual elevation, you would attract a really high soul. So this was for the betterment of the race ultimately. And so if you weren't married, then you were not allowed to do these practices, and you were not allowed your hashish pill, and you had to be satisfied with your magic mirror.
No wonder the attention waned a little bit from
yes,
that.
Exactly. But nevertheless, notice that sexuality here is being transformed, because now we have this idea that now we want two people who are in love. We want the woman to be in love. We want the man and the woman to have the same attitude as they approach this, with a spiritual awareness. We're approaching a kind of tantric thing here, and we're going to take hashish in the yogic tradition in order to open up the centers, and so this is a whole nother animal from the Christian heritage in America, where sexuality was for the most part in the early days demonized as something that was necessary but part of this world of suffering. Yeah. And now it was being made into a way to attract higher level souls, so that you can make it into a world that isn't so in such a bad way. And doesn't it foreshadow hippies ultimately in the 1960s who suddenly go crazy with birth control pills and drugs, and let's all have sex and take various intoxicants and experience the highest levels of sexual arousal and the kinds of visions and experiences that can bring to us. That was already there in this sort of very early stage in the Hermetic Brotherhood of Luxor. And they weren't the only one. There was a long history of this kind of experimentation around how do we use sexuality, even to the point where Paschal Beverly Randolph would be very recognizable to people today who do things like masturbate in order to envision something that they wish to get, like a car or a job or something like this. And he taught that sexuality could be used that way, that to envision things that you wanted during orgasm was a way of manifesting these things. So way back then, the ideas that are supposedly so modern now were already being applied. And another interesting thing about that is that notice how America has changed the whole approach here. So this is related to Catherine Albanese's study of the influence of the pursuit of happiness in American religion. And her belief is that the pursuit of happiness has completely transformed American religion, including Christianity, because, for instance, Christianity in America changes from you don't want to be rich because if you're rich, you can't get into heaven. Sexuality is a terrible snare. The purest people don't have sexuality. They stay away from it. This world is a world of suffering. You're very likely to be damned, even if you lead a good life. That's just the nature of sin, and so on. In America, it quickly turns into, well, God wants you to be rich. God wants you to be happy. God wants you to have girlfriends. It's a completely different viewpoint. And we can see this beginning in these little communities and these little organizations who are redefining these subjects and who really present us with the beginnings of our more modern viewpoints.
It's fascinating to me to just kind of watch, and we've gone so far over the time, but this is such a good conversation. So firstly, thank you for being so giving with all these ideas and these, like, weaving it together so beautifully.
Thank you.
So will you allow me just a little bit more of your time?
Yes, of course, please.
Perfect. So there's this expansion from the slavery periods, and we see this folk cult and practices starting to expand itself, this blend of spiritualism that starts to open up shifts in the music. We look at the jazz period and then almost the rebellion against that structure of music, that solid harmonies, where it's a little bit more chaotic, which many believe is responsible for the shifting of the morality and the opening up of those kind of mental gates, if you will. And then we mentioned the kind of advent of the 60s, and we also know, another famous kind of American piece of history is Jack Parson. And was something that I don't know how many people are aware of, the sex magic experiments, including I think it was the Babylonian rite that he did, where L. Ron Hubbard, from which we've got Scientology again, was a participant or a co-collaborator inside of that. And many even believe that it was the Babylon sex magic rite that gave birth to the next age, as he claimed to have taken the word of the new aeon at that period of time. But this interesting relationship between sexuality, the arts, preceding these shifts in cultural dynamics, with this elevation of this concept of pleasure, this concept of happiness, and how that unfolds. How does that paint in the landscape? Tell us a little bit about that.
Sure. Well, I'd like to start by saying that there is a tendency, especially in the music world, but in most arts, to take rebels and ne'er-do-wells and then institutionalize them into representative or exemplary artists. So a good example is Bach. And by most people, Bach is considered to be very conservative. He worked for the churches. He is held up as the example of a perfect kind of religious musician. But if you read about him, if you read the more modern biographies of him, you learn that he pulled a knife on another composer and had a street fight with him. He was sent to jail for things that he did. He was an infamous drinker and had an incredible capacity for beer, which he loved. He was a big, big beer drinker. And he had all kinds of girlfriends, and he was famous for fornicating in the organ loft, right?
Okay.
Appropriately enough.
Yeah.
And so we see that there is this pattern where, so Bach, whose music is so filled with life, he was actually one of us, if you will. He wasn't this strictly religious, sober Protestant at all.
Nice to know.
And so as we get into American history, we have this fascinating thing that happens where, as enslaved people are brought here, and this great tragedy of American history, and this centers around New Orleans, because the people who were brought over often came through first in the New Orleans area, and there was a very large population there that came through the Caribbean, and the African beliefs and music and such that had been brought to the Caribbean and then had changed there under the influence of the indigenous people to some degree, was then brought to America. And we see its negative effect in, for example, Salem, where there is an enslaved woman at the center of all this who had some little typical Caribbean practices and beliefs that were suddenly blown up into this satanic panic. But you also see something that became so important to America that occurs in New Orleans. And this begins with these congregations that would happen, these gatherings in Congo Square. And essentially, the people that ran New Orleans allowed the enslaved people to gather together in Congo Square one day a week to have these big dances. And they could play their music and they could dance around. And white people would stand around in these big crowds and watch this uninhibited dancing, listen to these amazing rhythms. And of course, each of these drum rhythms was its own spiritual path. And each of these drum rhythms had its own kind of influence on the human psyche. And it was a much more sophisticated kind of music than any of those people believed. And so, for example, the very famous voodoo priestess, Marie Laveau, would attend these events. And even though she was this very high-ranking citizen in New Orleans, she would dance with everybody else. And eventually, white people would wind up dancing too. It was very scandalous. From those Congo Square sessions, there is a direct and easily provable line into jazz music and ultimately into rhythm and blues and rock and roll. Those rhythms, that dancing, that all of that was going on there really gets mixed up with the slave songs in the fields and the gospel music as it was reinvented by the enslaved people. And it turns into this new form of music. And this music was such that, for example, there were stories told that when the music was happening in Congo Square, and the same thing was later said about jazz, that sometimes the music would drift on the wind into the more wealthy areas of New Orleans where the women would faint when they heard it, right? It was jungle music. It was out of control. The sexuality was just waves of it were coming out of this music. And later, same thing would be said about jazz. People could faint because it was just so overpowering. And so jazz and rock and roll, which are arguably the most American original art forms, not really American, really African, but born in America. And they come about because of this melting pot that occurs musically around the celebrations of enslaved people in New Orleans. In a similar way, we find that the American preoccupation with the idea of cool, which has been a big deal for many generations. I mean, people are really concerned about being cool. And to say to somebody, you're not cool, or that's so uncool, was a devastating insult for may still be. And the thing you wanted more than anything was to be told, wow, you're cool, or your music is cool. Well, it turns out that whole concept of cool, the idea of something that there's something divine about it. There's a calmness and a beauty and a natural perfection to it. And that can be said of a human being who knows how to deal with crisis situations. It can be said of a great drum beat. It can be said of a carnelian bead. And those are all Yoruba ideas. Those are African ideas and African terminology. There was an African word, I believe, ashe, that was about all those things. And so the idea that a bead, a good leader, and a piece of drumming could all be the same thing, cool. And we understand what that means thanks to the Yoruba. So we can see that in America, there is a huge influence coming out of Africa. And I remember Jung famously said that he thought that America was infatuated with enslaved people. And he pointed out when he visited America how strange he thought it was that Southern slave owners, the descendants of Southern slave owners, were speaking in essentially African accents. A lot of their mannerisms and a lot of what they thought was cool was African, even though they were racists who held Africans in contempt and were doing everything they could to suppress them and to keep them from having rights.
That's a unique.
And so he thought that was classic psychological compensation, right? And we see this continually as we look at American metaphysical religion, the way that this ripples. So one example that I like, which is almost bizarre, is you get the Aquarian gospel of Jesus the Christ. Very popular in New Age circles, but it predates the New Age. And And this book, alleging to be a channeled scripture from the Akashic records of what Jesus did when he wasn't in the Bible, when he visited Tibet and these other areas, this probably based on a book by a guy named Nautovich, I believe Nikolai Nautovich, who had seen manuscripts in a Hindu temple referring to someone named Isu, who sounded a lot like Jesus, and then had written a book about it saying that he thought that Jesus had visited. Now, his book was considered fraudulent, and he wasn't really very popular. My belief is that the author of the Aquarian Gospel was familiar with Nautovich because it's just too similar. But he had the brilliant idea of formatting it to look like the Bible and these little columns and all of that. And the language was very biblical, and people ate it up. Now, he came from a rather white supremacist background, and he does not seem to have been somebody who was particularly pro-diversity at all. And oddly enough, years later, one of the major influences on Louis Farrakhan's organization and on the whole Black Muslim movement was very influenced by the Aquarian Gospel and created this thing that was called the Circle Z, is it? Bible. If I remember it correctly, I'll let you know. I think it might be the Circle Z, but I'm not 100% sure about the letter. But it's a Bible with this red circle and a letter in it. And it's a bunch of collections of writing that the leader of this new organization thought his congregation should be reading. And a big chunk of it was the Aquarian Gospel of Jesus the Christ. And his movement was sort of a Black separationist movement. So the writing about Jesus Christ of a probable white supremacist became very important in the Bible created by a Black separatist.
Wow.
These kinds of cross-pollinations are occurring constantly in America and in American spirituality, my book is really is a survey of some of them. I mean, you can't, it would have been 1,500 pages if we had put everything in there that deserved to be in there. But these hybrids to me are very fascinating, and they show a diversity and a willingness to be influenced by other cultures that America should be celebrating. But instead, of course, right now we have this movement toward reestablishing some kind of theocratic autocracy. The idea that we can go back in time and put women and people of color back in their place and take away rights from gay, lesbian, and their allies and bisexuals and such, and reinstitute some kind of a Christian theocracy. And that is something that has also been a preoccupation of America since the earliest days, obviously with the Pilgrims. But I think, after all this study, it just seems to me that it betrays America's actual history, which is filled with diversity and cross-pollination.
And given everything you shared, it seems that maybe at the edge of this one side, its shadow is going to grow even stronger for its collapse, as if there's a consistent duality resolution that's occurring throughout the history, not only in the magic, but in the culture. And the question is the survival of what comes through as a result, what that death and rebirth process may look like. There's a closing bit of a question that I want to bring things to, and then I want to comment just on some of what you're working on at the moment. The thought in my head, video killed the radio store is one of the old classic songs, right? Kind of like how Amazon killed the bookstore, right? Places like the Bodhi tree that, again, was this cornerstone that opened up occult access to books and materials and these thinkers. You were there at those stages and those journeys. So my question is a little bit of a rounded one, but you've seen this revolution, this journey that's been happening, or this resurgence very much of the feminine spirit and the communal spirit that's been an expression in there. And we spoke about the mediumship, and one of the people that my audience is very familiar with is Joe Dispenza. And I point out how even Joe Dispenza was taught by Ramtha. And you talk about Jay-Z Knight and the stories around that. You talk about, she wrote the Safe books. I forget her name.
Jane Roberts.
Jane Roberts, thank you. Thank you. Who wrote the Safe books. And we see this progression or this expansion of the feminine. And one of the other pieces that I believe you're working on, or you've got a lecture actually coming up about that, around the revival of Sekhmet.
Mm-hmm.
It seems there's this new manifestation, or this maturing of the feminine that was so repressed for so long, that seems to be manifesting in the culture as a we're not going to take it attitude in many, many ways. Can you unpack that a little bit for us?
Okay. Yes, it's interesting because throughout American history, we see strong influence from women and strong women. And in times, so let's use the example of Phineas Quimby, who was the kind of grandfather of the whole mind cure, new thought movement. And Quimby had some ideas. He was apparently able to talk people out of their illnesses. And his idea was essentially that Christ makes the soul perfect, and the perfect soul embodies the body perfectly. And so there is no illness in the body. And he had a saying that is a wonderful meditation koan, which was, health is the way that the body experiences the eternity of the soul. Now, as academics got into studying him, they discovered that he was illiterate, and the books that are supposedly his could not possibly have been written by him. They also found that he was nowhere near the kindly old, very saintly man that he was presented as by his followers. He was a guy who cussed a lot. He was very bold in his use of language. He also was sometimes talking some of his female patients, not just out of their illnesses, but out of their clothes. And he was kind of aggressive about it at times, apparently. Among the women around him were two women who are good illustrations of how women used to be treated in America, and then how sort of they've broken out. So we suspect that his secretary is the actual author of his manuscripts, because she was quite eloquent, and the eloquence in her own letters reflects the eloquence in his work. And she was very devoted. She wrote down all of his talks and all of his readings, and it's pretty certain that she was the driving force and the voice of what has become known as his books. And that kind of stealing by male leadership from women who are working for them was very common in the history of American metaphysical religion. He had a patient by the name of Mary Baker Eddy, and she was healed by him and moved by his teaching, and she thought that she could do a better job than he did at presenting it, because she thought that what he had done was he had revealed the science under the teachings of Jesus. So to her, Christianity was a science, the science of healing sickness. And she started the Church of Christian Science, which was hugely successful, so successful that even a famous writer like Mark Twain was jealous of her success and often wrote disparagingly of her in very funny ways. But she went out and she established this international presence of Christian Science, establishing the future for people like, I think, so many of them. I mean, you've got the great success of Jane Roberts. You've got the great success of Ramtha and the Jay-Z community. And you've got Elizabeth Clare Prophet and what she did with Saint Germain there. But you still have the male shadow sort of behind that. So Ramtha is really the whole story, not Jay-Z. Jay-Z is this powerful woman who has done all sorts of things, and it's her success, but really it's Ramtha. Yeah. That's why it's a success. Same thing. Now we've got Saint Germain over here with Prophet. And so her power comes to her, even though she's a leader of a big community with a lot of wealth, there is this idea that her power is coming from Saint Germain, a man. And even with Mary Baker Eddy, we see that Quimby was really the source of the ideas that she used. And we can even see that in the case of somebody like Marianne Williamson, who's teaching the Course in Miracles, and the Course in Miracles was something channeled by a woman, and she kept it all anonymous. She was a very successful medical administrator, I believe, and didn't want anybody to know that she had written this until after her death, and her wishes were respected. And then Marianne Williamson came along and became very successful with these teachings and used them to help many people at a time when AIDS was devastating communities in America. And yet, even behind that, there's Jesus, because the teachings are said to be directly from Jesus. So there's a man behind it again. And so this is a strange phenomenon, but it's universal, unfortunately. And throughout the history of most religions, we see this, where there are women who kind of pop through, who have important things to teach and are maybe even made into saints, but their positions are always threatened by men and controlled by men. Well, in America, there was this really huge explosion. I mean, if you look at the 1960s, the way that women are treated is not that different. I mean, the idea is, wow, you've got the pill, so that means that if you're not having sex with me, you're a prude. And if you look at the ideal for women in the 1960s, they tend to be very wide-eyed girls. They're very fresh. They're being taught that nature wants them to have sex, and that's part of this underground American tradition that women should be like that. But by the time the New Age runs around, we're getting a different kind of phenomenon. The ancient Egyptian religion revivalist movement is very much driven by women. And there are women who establish new lineages of Egyptian priesthood in the world. And you have people like Lynn Andrews, who, she's a very questionable character in the terms of appropriation, and is the teaching that she was teaching real shamanism, and who really taught her and such. But she was hugely influential. And we have people like Normandy Ellis, who wrote Awakening Osiris, a new version of the Book of the Dead. And that book was very influential. And so in the New Age, it seems that women are sort of rising up. Marilyn Ferguson wrote The Aquarian Conspiracy, which was a New Age book about how we were on the verge of this intense scientific revolution that was going to make everything so much better. And so it seems that there has been this movement toward liberating female sexuality that's been going on in America since some early days, like with the Shakers, going back to the beginning of our discussion, where it was the young girls who heard the heavenly music and then prophesied. And so where do we go from here? I think that Sekhmet, for instance, is an interesting thing to look at, because within the revival of ancient religion, it's unquestionable to me that the most popular, the most striking case of a god being almost invisible, left out. I mean, you could hear about Isis and Osiris and all that stuff for thousands of years, but Sekhmet was really forgotten. Let's say in 1950, you could only encounter a statue of Sekhmet in a museum. You might find her name in some old tome of the Book of the Dead or something like that. You might see an image of her in an old Hollywood movie because some set designer got carried away with Egyptology and he saw a lion-headed woman and he thought, wow, that's great. Let's put that in the background. And other than that, there was no information, there were no images, there was nothing. And beginning in the mid-century, 20th century, we start seeing books. We start seeing John Lennon and Yoko Ono are involved with Sekhmet statues. And Yoko talks about Sekhmet. And then we have Robert Masters writing a book about his experiences with Sekhmet coming through in therapeutic situations. And he decides this is actually the reemergence of an Egyptian goddess that has seized him as well as other people. And he writes a book telling people, this is what you want to do. These are the exercises that Sekhmet has taught me. And if you're interested in this, you should do these things. And then there are more and more books. And suddenly, especially with the arrival of the internet, the image of Sekhmet becomes seen everywhere. And at this point, we now can buy statues. We can buy coffee cups. We can buy decals for our walls and bed linens and anything you can imagine with Sekhmet on them. And she is especially embraced by women and by feminists who find in her this image of power, because one of her names, for example, was she before whom all gods tremble. And she was supposed to be the power of justice that keeps life possible. And her power, her name means power. So she is literally female power. And she was the most the strongest of the Egyptian goddesses in the Memphite triad, and was even all through, even when they were worshiping all the various male gods, Osiris and Ammon and the rest, she was the special protector of the pharaoh. She would lead the pharaoh into battle. She would lead the pharaoh into the afterlife. And she was the protector of women, and physicians were considered to be priests of Sekhmet. So on one hand, she was the healer, but on the other, she could send plague. And if human beings became too immoral, if they became too aggressive in exploiting the environment and started to be destructive, they would invoke this negative side of Sekhmet, and there would be plagues, there would be wars, there would be droughts, right? So now we have this huge resurgence of interest in Sekhmet, where you can read about her all over the place, and she's all over the internet. And to my shock, when I left working for Manly Hall and I went into punk rock and I toured, I mean, you can't imagine, I was already familiar with Sekhmet and had a lot of affection for this deity. And here we'd be at some punk show, and some punk girl would walk by with a giant Sekhmet tattooed on her arm. And so we'd have to go over and say, "Hi, so you're into Sekhmet?" And they go, "You know what Sekhmet is?" And then we'd have this big discussion, because punks weren't supposed to be into that stuff. So when I see this kind of resurgence, it's rather exciting. And so there's a lot of controversy right now among occultists who feel that maybe it's not such a great idea to wake up an ancient Egyptian war goddess who kills unjust human beings and brings plagues. And there are among those who believe in a certain definition of the egregore, or egregore, depending on your pronunciation, that that Sekhmet is a thought form that reawakened and is manipulating your followers and all this. And there's a lot of talk about appropriation. There are people of color who are like, "Listen, white people, this is an African lioness goddess. This isn't your goddess." But there are people like this brilliant artist named Tommaso Nosferua, who is undoubtedly the world's greatest icon creator for ancient Egyptian revivalism. And he answers these kinds of statements by saying, if there are gods, the gods will choose who will worship them and how they will worship them, and human beings have nothing to say about it. So Sekhmet is being reinvented. As before, she was a justice goddess for the elite, and there was also famous parties, is when they would have a war, if the war ended, and it didn't kind of matter if it was a victory or a defeat, as long as there wasn't an invasion, because no one really knew what happened anyway. The pharaoh would come back and claim victory, and no one knew the better if it was a defeat. And so they'd have this huge party. The idea was to calm down the rage of Sekhmet, which had been aroused by war. And it's the first real festival, like music festival. There was music, there was alcohol, there was fornication all night long. And then in the morning, there was this kind of blissful feeling of peacefulness. And she was associated with that as well. And so with music. And so I think that as we look into what's going on these days, and we have TikTok and we have Instagram, and we have many young people, especially young women, who are embracing all of these subjects and who are fascinated with spirituality, alternative forms of spirituality, and are teaching each other. And in some cases, people with very little experience setting themselves up to teach very rapidly because they're quick learners and they feel that they have something to share. And there is value in that, because students can teach students. And it's been my experience that the depths of these studies, no matter how good your training is and no matter how suited one is for the task, they do take time. And one must be able to view the experience of life through a certain length of perspective, different for every person, to get the greatest depths of these teachings. That's at least been how I've experienced it, and those around me seem to also be experiencing it that way too. But there's so many steps along the way, so we can get a wealth of information from people who may not have those deepest levels. And so the question becomes, well, what if we want to study the deepest levels? How do we do that? How do we recognize when there's a teacher who is offering those levels? And my answer to that would be, first of all, that I have found that those who have the deepest understanding tend to be a little less accessible. They're not going to be probably out there eagerly branding themselves and such. They like quiet lives. At least the people that I've met who've been the most dramatic spiritual presences have been people like that, who live fairly modest lives, fairly quietly. People know about them. There's word of mouth, and they may even be visible. They may write books and such, but you usually don't see them aggressively packaging their teachings, because they realize the limitations of words, and they realize the value of context and of personal timing. And so my answer to people who ask me about that is, when you're ready for that teacher will be there. It may be a long relationship, it may be a short relationship, but when you are ready, the teacher will be there. And so in the meantime, why not enjoy all this plethora of information that's going out there, but keep an open mind. And also remember that paradoxes are always part of life in this dimension, and that we have to be able to hold paradoxes. I feel that one of the biggest dangers currently is our fetish for certainty. And everybody wants to be right. Everybody wants to know exactly what's going on. Everybody has a theory about what's really going on. But people are very uncomfortable with not knowing. And all the greatest wisdom in our world, Socrates, Christian Rosenkreutz, they all said, I know that I don't know. And knowing that you don't know is so important. And it makes learning all that much more fun. So, for example, people say to me, wow, you know so much stuff. I mean, look what's in this book and all that. I'm a beginner. I see myself as ignorant. And I say in the book, I'm not trying to sell anything here. I'm just sharing these stories that moved me. But we all need to know that we have these limited, beautifully infinite in a way, but limited simian brains we're working with. And I always was very amused by Madame Blavatsky's belief that people don't ever directly connect with gods. The best you can hope to do is connect with your higher self, and doing that will make you think you're in touch with God. But she said it's ridiculous to think that monkeys, basically human monkeys, can actually understand God and have actual deep understanding and communication with an unlimited, infinite consciousness. We might get small glimpses which transform our lives. But I like that kind of modesty. I like the idea of being open-minded to find learning anywhere, from the youngest, most simple approach to the most complex and well-developed over decades kind of approaches. I find them all fascinating. And I wish that people were a little more relaxed in their approach to all this, that they weren't seizing on what is right and on this is the only right way. And instead realize that there are many, many ways. And part of the joy of life and part of the privilege of where we are now is that we can peruse the history of the world in spirituality. And so finally, I think that it's very important that we understand that we all need to get along, and that we need to have an environment that we can leave for future generations, that we face up to our responsibility as caretakers of what we've been given to experience here, and that we embrace that idea. And so rather than being lost in our own desires or being in reaction to injustices that are occurring to us and around us, that if we can focus on the idea, and this was at the essence of the Rosicrucian teachings, the idea of a universal reformation that occurs because each of us in our own little corner of the world has a little reformation. So we're not going to be out there trying to join a powerful group or having a revelation that will change everything in the world. You all must follow me because I have the truth, or laughing at others who disagree with us because we think that they're ignorant. It's about taking in the whole amazing, paradoxical beauty of this mystery of life. And while we're here, which is a short time, just feeling the love for all of it, which is a hard thing to do in this world, especially the way that people treat each other and the way they treat the world. But if you can do that, if you can get to the point where you can appreciate that this is a learning place, as one of the most amazing psychics I ever met said, Edgar Cayce, or rather the entity speaking through him said, when asked by my girlfriend, what is the meaning of life? Why is life like this on Earth? Why is it so shitty? He said, Earth is part kindergarten and part the devil's island of space. He said, all the little Hitlers from all over the universe are brought here to learn some very basic lessons. I have to tell you, of all the explanations I had ever heard about the human condition, that one has really stuck with me.
That's an accurate way of how we play out our shadow issues together.
Exactly.
So you're working on a book on the origins of the Rosicrucians and that journey and exploring that. You've also got another one coming out on the Orphic hymns, I believe.
Yes.
But on top of that, you've got Stuart and Edward and Betty White's book as well. You are incredibly busy. How do you even find the time? And then I believe you've got the talk we kind of teased about. That's at the Last Tuesday Society that you're going to be talking about. When is that one coming up?
I think it's May 8th. It's early in May. And yes, the reason I can do all this stuff, I think, is because of Manly Hall, because I watched him multitasking at that incredible level that he did. And although I don't feel that I'm anywhere near at his level, I did learn from him to be able to work on multiple things at once. And you can refresh yourself. You know, you work on one book and you get deeply into it, and you get exhausted, and then you take a break and you go into a completely different project, a different book even, and the new subject refreshes you. And so that's how I can do it. And the Orpheus book, which was co-written with my girlfriend and my wife, she also was a friend of Manly Hall's, and he married us actually in his backyard at a date that he and his wife chose, kind of forced us practically into marrying each other. Although we were already together, we just didn't believe in marriage. And so he really gave me that inspiration. And so with her, in dedication to him, we have written this book it's called The Magic of the Orphic Hymns. And so it gives an historical survey of the unbelievable influence of Orpheus and the Orpheus mythology and mysteries in Western culture. The way that it's influenced Western countercultures is really dramatic and constant. And also, we redid the hymns, because the original Orphic hymns are very boring. They're very formulaic. And the reason is because the priests, they knew everything about the deities they were talking to, and they did not need really to talk about the details to get a feeling for what they were getting at. Instead,
attributes.
Yes, exactly. So what we did was we studied the cults for all of these different gods, everything we could find out. There's so much new research. And we added each of these cult attributes so that the correspondences were there within the poetry of each hymn.
That's so important.
And we had some friends into theurgy who tried it out, and they came back to us with how the hymns worked for them, and that was very exciting. And the hymns are very powerful. I mean, Marsilio Ficino, who was called the father of the Renaissance because he translated Plato and Hermes Trismegistus, those writings, many others as well, he said about them, I learned from Orpheus that love existed and that it held the keys to the whole world. The whole power of magic consists in love. And the hymns are a way of bringing back harmony because they address every single aspect of life, and they address it with love and appreciation. So it's a very healing experience. And then the Rosicrucian one was just picked up by Inner Traditions and will probably be out at some point in 2023. And that one is based on all the latest research, of which there is an enormous amount. And it is really looking at the political context and the cultural context in a way that it hasn't been looked at before. And so we look deeply into the court of Rudolph II, who was this occult emperor. And we look at the tragedy of Frederick and Elizabeth, the king and queen of Bohemia, and what the influence of these people were on the people who wrote the manifestos. And ultimately, the new research seems to be pointing in this direction, and I tend to agree with it, that what we're looking at when we're looking at the manifestos is something that could be compared to the Beats, the hippies, the situationists. It's bright college students influenced by radical professors, and there's much more satire in it than is usually understood to be in there. And I think that they were trying to do something that isn't that dissimilar from what happened when Allen Ginsberg wrote the poem Howl. And this became for a generation this touchstone for a new way of looking at life. And I believe the manifestos were the same thing in a way. They were a critique of the current society, a threat against the enemies of the beginnings of science and of freedom of religion, as much as Protestants were willing to give it. And they were something that you would encounter in your own little corner, and you would say, wow, there's other people who are reading Houdini and they're reading Giordano Bruno and Agrippa and Dee, and I'm not the only one who's into this stuff. And I think the intention was, as I said earlier, to encourage people like John Winthrop the Younger, who we mentioned a while back, to go out and live their lives according to these principles in their own little part of the world. But instead, what happened was people were writing books and pounding their chests saying, I should be a Rosicrucian, and I want to be a member. And other people were saying the Rosicrucians are the devil's Jesuits, and they're trying to destroy the world. There was a panic with a riot in Paris when they thought Rosicrucians had gotten into Paris and were going to seed chaos everywhere. And it was very depressing for people like Johann Valentin Andre, who certainly wrote at least one of the manifestos. And that's not what they wanted at all. And they backed up quite a bit from what they had originally said after that in their writings, not so much in the teachings, but they took out a lot of the sort of more freedom-oriented ideas to such a degree, these freedom-oriented ideas, that there are people now comparing the manifestos to being the first science fiction novels, right? Or the first fantasy novels. And so I see it more in that way, rather than these elevated masters who came about and they wrote these manifestos to let the world know that they were there and that everything was about to change. I think what we really have is one of the most successful hoaxes in history, which is not to say that it wasn't filled with wisdom and inspiration. It continues to inspire people today, including myself. But it was, I think, written by some precocious kids, basically.
Fascinating. There's a closing thought that I then want to bring in. You and I spoke about this earlier, and you had the position where you were screener for Manly P. Hall, and we also shared, there's this interesting kind of paradigm that opened up in my mind as you were talking through the journey of the revival with Sekhmet. And what we're seeing, and it was very fascinating because I was thinking about another author, David Elkman, that I've spoken to, who was involved with the Jordan-led codices, that there was some controversy out and he's busy working on some new material that demonstrates the authenticity behind it. But in that, there's claims of the earlier, even during the period of Jesus, where there was a revival of the feminine. That it wasn't the formulation of Christianity, it was not a formulation of the new, more of a revival of the original feminine. And we see that feminine coming together again now in the more almost assertive Sekhmet manifestation. And one of the tactical destructions already is some of the destruction of the symbolism of the overt masculine energy in some of the archetypal forms. And one of those that we spoke about earlier, is the one of Carlos Castaneda. Again, one that is very well seen, and also the same thing that you're talking about here, it seems, where there is good, but there's also bad. There's also the other side and the shadow component. And I want to raise that because you mentioned it as well in these recent words. TikTok's great, or Instagram's great, and all these tiny little tidbits of knowledge is fantastic. But the honest fact is that occultism, metaphysics, this journey is a long one. It is a massive journey. Even before this video, there's my disclaimer at it. And in the disclaimer, I highlight that this takes years and there's always going to be debates on subjects, and you shouldn't just jump in haphazardly because there are real dangers for those that misrepresent.
So good you're doing that.
Thanks. So I want to hear from you and your journey, because again, the practice of this, even listening to you, is a revival in and of itself. Your own energy is an awakening and an uplifting, and I can feel and sense that, and I think the audience can feel and sense that as well. There's the hope and there's the light that comes with that. Earlier, I asked you about those 5 lessons that you got from Manly P and how that transitioned you. Recognizing what you have had seen on how this can go wrong for many people. What are the common pitfalls? If you can give a framework of that, and then if you can give maybe 3, I'm making this one a little easier because we've got to close it. We're closing up over time. Paradigms or practices or frames that the initiate or the seeker should constantly be vigilant of in order to ensure that they are progressing in this path in the most healthy and discerning way for their own well-being and success.
Okay. I would say that, first of all, I'd like to start with the 3 paradigms. I guess I should start actually here. My job as a screener for Manly Hall, why that was something that led me to these understandings. So he was often seen as a last resort for people who are suffering because they had become involved in forms of spirituality that amplified psychological problems that they had brought with them in the first place. So they would come to him to say, I got into spiritualism and there's an entity that's occupying my house and terrorizing my family and I don't know what to do. Or they would come to him and say, I tried ceremonial magic and I opened a door to a dimension and I can't seem to shut off this voice that's going on in my head and saying things that are scary to me. Or they would come to him and say, even about traditional religion, I'm Catholic and I became obsessed with something and now I feel that the devil is after me. He didn't have time, especially in his later 80s, to meet with everybody. And he also attracted a lot of strange people. So when he found that he could trust me, and especially that he could trust Tamara, my girlfriend and wife, he would have us talk to them. He would have us read the letters, take the phone calls, or go visit the organizations that wanted to do something with him. And so we got a real crash course in the ways that spirituality can go wrong. And so I would say that, first of all, he had said, and I asked him once, I said, if you had it all to do again, how would you do it differently? And he said that in the early days, he was more of a real occultist. He was more aggressive. And he talked about initiates and ascended masters. And so I, for instance, went on something that in her book, Tamara calls initiate fever, to my embarrassment, because I wanted to meet a Rosicrucian and I wanted to have a hidden master approach me and teach me. So I had to practice celibacy and I had to do all these things. And I got myself into all kinds of trouble, actually, because I was trying so hard to be good that I invoked my shadow and created all kinds of trouble for myself and others around me. That's how I found out about these things, through personal experience and through experiencing what other people brought to him. And so I would say that the first thing, what he told me was that if he had it all to do again, that he would tell people that they should study psychology before they dive deep into metaphysics, that they should pick some form of psychology, Maslow, Jung, Freud, whatever tickles your fancy, hopefully more than one, and learn something about how the human psyche works. Because then they would have simple tools that would help them to understand what was going on. Now, I'll give you an example that Tamara often uses, which I think is brilliant, which is when she's approached by somebody who says, wow, I had this amazing experience where I thought I saw my grandmother and she had a message for me and she said this, and I don't know what to think. I mean, did my grandmother visit me? What Tamara says is, maybe your grandmother visited you. Maybe it was an archetype in your unconscious that was expressing wisdom that you needed to hear. Maybe it was some other entity pretending to be your grandmother. Maybe you just hallucinated the whole thing. But the real question is the message helpful? The message is what you should be looking at. Don't spend so much time worrying about the source of it and what that means. Worry about, if I apply this in my life, will this improve my life? Another one is something that Stuart Edward White used to teach. He said, anytime that these two things pop up in a religious teaching, run for your life. One is when they tell you that you and only you are the chosen one.
Oh.
Be careful. Another one is urgency. He actually said it's just like the stock market. If somebody's really in a rush to get you to buy something, don't. And so he said, you don't have a sense of urgency about your spirituality. He said, your spirituality should feel like taking a walk in the woods with a dog you love. It should be a beautiful, natural experience. Let it take its time. Don't rush it, because you're going to find that it's in those quiet, tranquil moments that the most happens. And I would give the example of whatever you're doing, whether it's spiritualism or it's ceremonial magic, or let's talk about Don Juan for a moment. And what do we make out of Carlos, right? We thought that he was a guy going down there and finding out about the Yaqui, and that he was literally taught by the shaman. And then UCLA published the book, and it became a huge hit because hippies were experimenting at that time with mescaline and other drugs that he talks about. And so it was this massive influence. It had never been such a success. What did he do with that success? Well, he isolated himself. He bought a big kind of apartment building near UCLA, and he put what became known as his witches there, his female followers, and he did all kinds of weird mind games on them. And there's a new book coming out soon, I can't wait, called American Trickster, about him, that's been worked on for a long time. It's going to be brilliant. And it exposes a lot of fraudulence in his work. Modern anthropology went down there and really studied the Yaqui and realized that he was not teaching Yaqui teachings. That much of the detail of what he taught really had nothing to do with Yaqui beliefs. And yet, this is a person who has had and continues to have a tremendous spiritual influence on people. I know when I was a teenager and I read him, he changed my life. I mean, I'd always had a tremendous rapport with animals. Animals seemed to just naturally be attracted to me. And through my reading of his books, I suddenly realized that this was a spiritual thing, that there was a spiritual relationship between humans and animals, and wisdom could be gained from that. And so there's also stories about him. The famous one where one of his students became very ill and he wanted to visit her, but she refused to have visitors. And he kept saying, you need somebody to come visit you. And she kept saying, no, I won't allow it. And then one morning she woke up and there was a crow screwing up stuff on her porch. And every single morning that crow showed up until she got better. Well, he was famous for claiming that he had been taught how to turn into a crow. So what do we believe here? And then ultimately, after he plays these mind games and all kinds of weird sexual games on these people who were his disciples, these women, a bunch of them disappeared after his death. They found the bones of one out in Death Valley.
Yeah.
And we don't know what happened to them. So we can look at him and say, well, this was an evil guy. He was lying. He made all this money. And what about UCLA? At some point, they must have realized that this stuff was fraudulent. On the other hand, you cannot deny the impact that he has had on people and on their spiritual paths, and that he did encapsulate in his work truths from the indigenous traditions that were transformative for people. And so getting back to the three things, so no urgency, right? Whenever you're learning or practicing, keep it as calm and as tranquil as possible, because no matter what you do, it's like this. If you throw a stone in a pond, this famous metaphor, and the ripples start, then all the things that were once reflected in that pond, the sky, for example, can no longer be seen in that pond. And that's the way we are. When we're urgent, when we're driven by our fears or our desires or our reactions, and we take that into ceremony or ritual or meditation or into spiritualism and channeling, we are like disturbed water, and we're not going to get clear reflections of the sky. If we become truly calm and let that water settle and become tranquil, then you get that mirror-like surface in which the sky can be reflected in all its detail. And that is the ideal for meditation, for ritual, and for all the rest, is that deep tranquility. And then finally, I would say that if you fall into using spirituality for vengeance, to get an edge, to succeed in an unnatural way, to force someone to love you and such, those are interesting experiments, but know that you're walking on dangerous ground, because now you are attempting to force your limited human perspective on nature. And nature has a funny way of teaching human beings and all beings when they're doing something that doesn't go in accord with what's happening in nature at that time. And so it's important, I think, to examine our motivations. And this is true in all areas of life. If you go to do something, even if it's a good thing, but the reason you're doing it is to get back at somebody, there's a taint to it. This has been my experience. And that taint will show up, and it will affect your results. And so one good approach, I think, is something that Manly Hall talked to me about, which is called the Pythagorean recollection. And this is to look at every night when we go to bed, to lie there for a few moments and go back over our day backwards. Essentially, it's like the after-death experience they describe, right? Or the near-death experience, where suddenly you see your life pass before your eyes. But you just take that day and you go back over it and you look very casually, very calmly, what could I have done better? I wish I had said that. I could have done this. I spent too much time doing that. And you don't want to get too neurotic about this. You just want to do it in a friendly, calm way. And it really helps over time, because you begin to develop this greater awareness of yourself and how you act and what your impact is in the world. So I think that is a good practice. And in general, I think that the best thing is when you're approaching spirituality, to realize this is your birthright. You do not have to struggle for it.
I love that. There's so many key ideas there. One of my old spiritual teachers was, my spiritual grandfather used to get in a lot of trouble with the Reiki community. And it was because he said, your direct access to God doesn't require an initiate, it requires you to fix you as the first step.
Exactly.
And what I love is that notion about if we're rushing, if we're chasing, or if we're going to magic or spirituality to get money or to get sex or to get any of these things. And I always say this, to the people that I work with and everyone that I try and share in the conversation. I'm like, there's this chase in the dark arts, especially, where people are like, oh, they want to chase the Goetia or these dark things because they want to evoke that, because they didn't have that much experience of success with the earlier levels. And I always say, if you're not having success at the earlier levels, it's not a problem with the spur, the problem's with you. You have to develop these skill sets. Chasing a more difficult flame is not going to give you more results. It's just going into a gym and thinking, I'm not getting enough results with an early weight, I should pick up 500 kilograms. You're going to crush your body.
Exactly.
It's not a mature approach. And to have a material pursuit or a biological pursuit or a psychological need pursuit inside of the occult world misses the fact that it's like that idea of that a true yogi would be offended by modern yoga because of the materialism around it. Right? It kind of defeats the purpose. The purpose of yoga was not to look better in yoga pants. It was in order to align ourselves more deeply. And when we are in that essence, we must be free from those necessities, those needs. We must be in a position of surrender. So the psychological work is a prerequisite. And it's something that must be done for us to find that healing inside of our journey. And we need to be authentic. There's the curse of the magician, oftentimes seen as the shadow magician, which becomes so in love with their isolation that they're no longer testing against the world. They're no longer going out and measuring against their community. And again, I think that's one of the big losses of when we had those more active communities still there. And the old rites and the old passages tries to bring us back into community and celebration, because the curse and the beauty of the internet is it is the double-edged sword. It can connect us, but it can also make us very self-righteous and unwilling to test our ideas against our true mirror, which is each other. So,
well, it gives us access to things that were entirely unavailable. I mean, for instance, many of those books and manuscripts in Manly Hall's vault, you can now look at yourself because the Getty Museum has made them available online. And there are books like The Platonist, that newspaper that were literally impossible to find or to see, that now are as easy as a couple clicks away. So that is an inestimable treasure. It's like we have an actual Akashic records, if you will, a record of everything that ever happened, although it's not necessarily very accurate. And so that, I think, is a great blessing to have access to all that information. But we do have the problem of the loss of those physical communities. And while chats and groups online can be very helpful, and people often talk about how horrible Facebook is, but if you go to some of the better Neoplatonic groups, some of the better Rosicrucian groups and such, you get amazing information, amazing people who have studied these things deeply and are willing to share what they've learned. So that's certainly a phenomenal treasure. But I can say that being around a community like the Philosophical Research Society, where you're actually there every day and you're interacting with people, and there's a sort of an amplified learning process that occurs. And I would also say one more thing, by the way, getting back, still thinking about those three things. I've come up with more than three. I think this is important to let your listeners know, especially the novices. Madame Blavatsky used to say, when you first get into this stuff, there's a big upsurge of your negativity. And it's something that she considered pretty much unavoidable. As we first start to learn these things, we become very enamored of spirituality, and we want to do our best, and we want to live up to the potential at the highest possible level. There comes upsurging from our depths all kinds of undealt with darkness. And we need to be patient with that, not afraid of it. We need to understand it. We can make art out of it. And I would also suggest putting right next to psychology, as Jung pointed out, astrology can be very helpful. I mean, what is more interesting to ourselves than ourselves? And when you get pretty good at astrology, and it's easy to do these days, given all the resources that are available online, and you study yourself, you can find all kinds of fascinating things about how you function psychologically, which enable you later, when you are doing spiritual practice, to recognize intrusions that are psychological and not spiritual.
I would also kind of even support that with what you're doing with music, because music and art is the thing that gives voice to these other components that cannot give voice. And it just connects us to that other component. And what you also raised, again, with the community thing is so important. We now know from polyvagal theory and systems like that actual genuine human connection is a necessity for the nervous system for it to function in optimal health. And when we go too long in isolation, or we separate ourselves too much, we get we have from our traumas is where we usually do it. And creates a dorsal shutdown, and we start to break down. And if we don't have social connection, in fact, if we're hiding from social connection, these are symptoms of a dis-ease. And the practice of occultism, the practice of magic, is not necessarily going to resolve it. It's going to amplify it. And we need to recognize that, and we need to have feedback, which we had in the old covens and the old communities and those things, that a mentor, a guide, or a friend could tell you, hey, you're going a little bit tense here. Something else going on there. So, Ronnie, this has been a breathtaking conversation. You are an absolutely brilliant soul.
Thank you.
No, truly, like while we were sitting in the earlier parts, my psychic, I was going through a shapeshift journey with you as I saw all these lifetimes of experience and spirit kind of communicating through you in the conversation. It's been an absolute gift. I'm happy to have had you on the show, and I do hope I get the privilege again when your next piece comes out.
Of course, I'll be happy to be here. I thought your whole presentation and your questions were superb. I really enjoyed it.
Thank you. It's been an honor. And then with that note, I look forward to our next conversation.
Likewise.